I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm standing on the traditional territory of the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk. I want to start by naming the history of this place and all who've lived here, and the history of those who are listening to this. In this country in particular, and in many places around the world, we actively practice forgetting. We disconnect ourselves from the land, from the plants, from each other, and from parts of ourselves. I offer you some stories today about how I learned to come back to myself, feel more whole and connected. My family comes from Wisconsin by way of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and 6 countries in Europe. We come with a history of settlement and colonization. We come with a history of disconnecting from the land and the people, but also a connection to land through farming, and a connection to community through service and teaching. My education taught me about who I should be and how. And like many of you, I learned about myself through stories told in books, in media, and from the people around me. I carry these stories in my body. One of the stories is that I was an athlete and I was full of privilege. I didn't think much about what my body did or how it affected others. That's how it works when you have privilege. You don't really have to be mindful of your impact. When I was 23, some of my privilege dissolved. That was the year that I realized that I don't identify as a woman. The first stories about gender were about how I wasn't doing it right. My sister, an older, well-meaning sibling and graceful dancer, tried to train me to walk better. She said my gait was too long and clunky, that I should be more graceful. So we practiced, me trying hard to mimic her moves and always falling short of grace. I never quite mastered the walk she tried to teach me, but that story of my body and my walk resurfaced years later. In 2007, I went to a workshop where I was asked to walk like a man, walk like a woman, and walk as myself. I was surprised that the man walk felt so much closer to my walk. That workshop stirred something up in me, but again, I practiced forgetting and disconnected from that awakening. That part of me didn't have a name yet, and I wasn't ready to make room for what it meant, but other people started seeing it in me. Transmasculine people started telling me about their experiences, like I felt or experienced the same things. Discomfort in women's spaces, gendered bathrooms, and how people would ask invasive questions about their bodies. I was confused about what they were seeing, but again, my training in forgetting was strong. I let it pass, reasoning they could think what they wanted. I'm an artist, and at the time, it was very clear that those unnamed parts in me were in fact trying to be seen. In 2010, I created a self-portrait, one showing how I looked then and how I thought I would look as a man. In my head, this was just an academic critique of binary gender and how we learn it. Binary gender is the assumption that there's only man and woman, and these are separate categories with nothing in between or beyond. You all know we're taught there's either boy or girl from a very young age, right? We're taught that we talk to babies and fetuses differently. We buy them different clothes and toys and have different expectations based on whether we call a kid a boy or a girl. You might even know that we give boys less affection and gentle touch. We expect girls to be quiet and care for the emotional needs of others. Based on genitals, we develop all sorts of expectations for how we should act, who we should be, and we force a separation from wholeness. My art was attempting to explore this gender binary, but I wasn't really quite ready yet to make room for what it meant. That part in me started to get louder and more persistent. Eventually, I had some curiosity about how I expressed my gender. I shaved my head, and after an intense feeling of fear, I crossed over to the men's section of the store. You know that feeling of anxiety that comes from breaking a rule? That's how I felt. I had sweaty palms, and I was looking around like I was gonna get in trouble. Eventually, I felt a little bit of relief when I found what I thought was a very cool jacket. I put it on, and I left feeling confident, sexy even. I've since learned that that jacket was not fashionable at all. But I felt really good wearing that walking away. I felt my body alternating between expansion and contraction as I explored what this might mean. Eventually, I had a conscious thought that I don't identify as a woman. That realization felt like an impact as I felt my body contracting in on itself, and I wrestled with questions about what that might mean. If not woman, then man, right? I've since learned there's so many different ways to embody gender that are beyond man and woman, but at the time, that was the option I understood. I wasn't sure what it meant to be a man. Over the next couple of years, I spent a lot of time in therapy and doing a lot of research about what that might mean to not identify as a woman. Friends handed me books and clothes, and they supported me in my explorations. My partners affirmed me every step of the way and held me in my questions. I didn't feel like I had the narrative I'd heard so often about trans people that we hate our bodies. I actually really liked mine, and I felt a sense of loss. because I liked what I had and I knew it, but as I connected more deeply to my whole self, I realized my most authentic expression of my body would be to pursue changes through hormones and surgery. I took a big step and I began living my life as Owen and taking testosterone. I didn't think ahead to the subtle and not so subtle ways my expectations for myself would change and the ways other people's expectations for me would change. At the time, I was working as a therapist, and I was working mostly with women and girls who'd been hurt mostly by men. As I worked to step into masculinity, I realized that I also carried the threat of being a perpetrator. I struggled with this, and I felt shame for carrying the images we all see of sex being conflated with violence. These images are often from the male gaze, and they dehumanize women and girls. I tried to put on my maleness in a way that wouldn't be violent, but what happened was I actually unknowingly contracted parts of my body, trying to be smaller and not allowing myself to be whole. What I learned is that it's not possible to embody white masculinity without the potential of being perceived as a threat sometimes. In many spaces in community, I was told it was no longer my place and that I shouldn't speak up because then I was a white man. I became hyper-conscious of the space I took up in groups, mindful of when masculine voices were heard and feminine voices weren't. I tried to use my place I was asserting as masculine to bring light to the feminine voices and to challenge the masculine ones. But what happened was that I lost my voice. Even though I felt vulnerable to this violence as well, I felt like because I was white and masculine, I had a responsibility to speak up, knowing others didn't have the access I had. I had this bigger bubble of space, and there was this clear expectation that I not reach out to the boundary of it, that I not reach out for contact or connection, that I don't ask for help from other people. That expectation caused a sadness, a loneliness, and a longing in me that I couldn't have anticipated. I couldn't have foreseen the ways that I would miss physical touch and the ways that I implicitly understood there's a threat to my physical safety if I challenged that expectation of staying within the bubble. I tried doing this male thing the right way, but it's a strange and confusing experience trying to embody masculinity. I was given more space, and my partner and I would give these trainings together. She also noticed some shifts. People would listen more intently to what I had to say, and they laughed harder at my jokes than they used to. Now, I'd just like to say I'm funnier now. But really, it was that I was masculine, and that playfulness was surprising instead of expected. Men aren't expected to entertain, be gentle, soft, or playful. When we are, we're seen as brave, more interesting, or sensitive. As Owen, people gave me feedback that it was so wonderful that I was a therapist and that I was feeling my emotions, feedback I didn't get previously. As you all know, there's different expectations that we have for men and women. As a woman, I grew up taking care of our house guests, offering them beverages and taking their coats. I was expected to contribute. Women often sat in the kitchen together, telling stories and connecting. As I asked to be called Owen, I realized that I had to choose where I belonged. If I wanted to assert I was male, I could go down to where the men sat, often silently drinking beer, talking sports. I could opt out of the labor, and that was seen as perfectly reasonable behavior. My partner Chelsea's grandma told her on multiple occasions to make me a sandwich or get me a beverage, like it was suddenly her job to serve me. Each event posed a choice, and I often wandered between the settings, feeling more comfortable connecting and contributing, but also wanting to try on this contraction in my chest and back and exploring this foreign male environment. In the choices, like restricting my movement, I swallowed pieces of me. I forgot how to be kind to myself and trust what my body wanted. I calcified my body and internalized the thoughts that who and how I was wasn't enough, that who and how I was wasn't strong enough or man enough on its own, that I had to play a part or fulfill a role if I wanted to be seen and respected as me. I wonder if this is how young boys feel as they learn what it is to be masculine, if they feel separation and loneliness and longing too. I threw myself into work and I lost my sense of play. The masculine part of me took the wheel and other parts were expected to take a backseat. Vulnerability, play, softness, and femininity were no longer welcome. Parts of me were being seen and validated, but at what cost? 3 years ago, I went to a training by Generative Somatics, this organization working for more embodiment in our movements for justice. Here I learned that we all need dignity, safety, and belonging. Our bodies form conditioned tendencies or patterns of behavior that help us to meet those needs. Somatics showed me how my conditioned tendencies work. Some of them were about being afraid of being read as female, trying to feel safe, or believing I didn't belong because I'm trans. Transphobia says that we should be small and quiet about who we are, that we should fit in and conform our gender so everyone else can be comfortable. Masculinity dictates a separation from feeling and vulnerability that was also at play in my body. While in contraction, I wasn't able to access my full spectrum of joy, happiness, and wholeness. As I listened more deeply to my body's longing, I slowed down, and I felt it calling for more fluidity and more feminine movement. I explored this by dancing, moving, and being in nature. My body was asking me to look at the parts I neglected as I attempted to claim this more masculine space. When we hold strong identities, like being a teacher, a writer, a man, or a woman, anything that doesn't fit that narrative gets shoved down, and we place it in our shadows, disconnecting from it. We silence the contradictions and ignore the parts of us that don't fit the narrative about who we believe ourselves to be. But really, all ways of being are possible within us. We need to stop being so afraid of those parts of ourselves and welcome them back, bring them back to light. My fear sometimes tells me not to be a visible trans person. I've internalized some of those negative messages about us. Even so, there's some freedom and some life I see in queer and trans people that gives me life and reminds me how good it feels to be free. Queer and trans people often creatively embody our movements because we didn't have images for what it means to be queer and trans, right? And we also creatively and artistically decide how we're going to express our gender and our sexualities. That permission, that audacity to take up that space and to claim that freedom gives me permission to be more free. When other people can be free, it gives us all permission to be more free. You know what? It's scary to ask for connection, and it's not easy to turn and look at inside of our shadow parts. It's a constant practice to allow for freedom and to extract internalized negative messages. But ultimately, all parts of us deserve dignity, love, and respect. We all deserve to take up the rightful space of our bodies and to honor our human call for connection. Our stories about gender and masculinity in particular attempt to disconnect us from each other and from ourselves. My body was clear that wearing these contractions was no longer serving me. It wasn't allowing me to feel whole or free. It seems, in order for our collective liberation and freedom, in order for us to all access the full aliveness of our beings, we need to stop being afraid of those parts of ourselves and how they show up in others. We need to turn to them and say, oh yeah, you're a part of me too. You deserve love and belonging as well. It's isolating to be in contraction. I think a lot of things that are happening in this world are happening as a result of deep loneliness and hurt, because we can't all thrive in a constant state of contraction. I invite you all to consider the ways that you are holding contractions in your body. When it was hard for me to remember this practice, I turned to the plants. I grew a garden from seed this year, and I was amazed at the inherent strength and wisdom of the plants. They knew what they need to thrive, and they know their rightful shape. They actually work together so whole, diverse communities can thrive. When a flower doesn't bloom, we don't blame that flower. We change its environment. We add more nutrients, water, or light. I'm not here today because I have any answers for you. I actually have a lot of learning that I'm still doing in my body in this moment and as I move through the world. I'm here today because 8 years ago I made a public commitment. I heard a lot of stories about LGBTQ young people committing suicide. And I said, I will be a visible adult for these kids, an example of a possible future. I want to make sure that I fulfill my promise, that I talk with queer youth and I tell them it's possible to be yourself. It's possible to love all parts of you, even when you're taught not to. I want to live and embody a future where wholeness is encouraged and all of our young people can thrive. I invite you to consider the ways that you are and the ways you see yourself. We can collectively move towards freedom and love and create a world that honors our collective history and turns towards our wholeness and allows for the wholeness in others. I invite you towards humility and curiosity. Those things are essential. I invite you towards humility and curiosity, and to ask your body, what is it longing for? What have you forgotten about your history of wholeness? And how can you practice listening to the land, to your body, and to each other, so we can all move towards freedom? Thank you.